we're going to move on to how we can help people reach their own conclusions based on the issues that we're discussing. Particularly, I'd like to hear your views on future scenarios.
So when it comes to the future scenarios, again, there is a graphical representation in here, which maybe we can sort of pull out on the website or something and look at that. But you can have a look at that. But clearly, the two key ones is when we are out and when we are in, and what people need to understand is the decision of leaving or staying actually changes the situation that exists after that point. So in like all real science, the actual observation of this event will actually change the situation. So if we stay in, you won't be able to make a decision if things go badly, let's say, to say, if only we'd have left, things would have been better. Because actually the world will then be different. And you would only then say, if we leave now, what will be the implication? You can't know what the future is, except that we will change it depending on how we go, and whether or not we will be more or less stable.
So you could make a little table for yourself and list the things that you want to know what could happen when you leave. So what is important to me, and then what happens if we stay, what happens if we go part way like Norway, what happens if we leave completely, how will that affect my either life, my business, the environment, my driving around in a diesel car, that sort of thing, and then think about what might happen. Or if you're in business, what would be the effect on my ability to Uberize my business if I suddenly decided to do it a different way and go trade with countries around the world in a different way? What would be my options, either stay in or leave or completely leave? So it's thinking about those sorts of things, and also the lag-in time that's included in some of the options, because this document's been really interesting in pointing out you can't just change something tomorrow. There will be a period of time for change, and then other potentials will come out of that period of time, whether we stay in or whether we leave.
And you've mentioned the timescales. It's estimated that it will take much longer. They indicate 2 years at the very least in order to manage that change. But it's probably going to take much longer.
Then that's just the core bureaucracy is going to take 2 years.
Yeah.
So literally just the signing of forms, the actual separation of us from Europe. Absolutely, it's going to take many. In fact, will we ever be actually separate? I mean, I don't think we're going to have this island UK and Europe. I mean, we have always been connected to Europe, no matter how mentally we might see ourselves as not.
I understand that if we were to leave but we wanted to trade again, we would have to leave and negotiate our way out and then negotiate our way back in again as an individual one lone state. So it's interesting to see how all that relates to a time scale.
Well, we're in a capitalist setup, which is a buying and selling market. There are 60 million, in the scheme of things, very wealthy people here in the UK. We want to buy stuff. We want to sell our stuff, slightly less perhaps, but we certainly want to buy stuff and we still want to sell. And if there is a market, if there are businessmen out there and there are businessmen here, they clearly want to trade, and everybody wants everybody to trade. So this is not a barrier. We're not talking North Korea here, or we're not separated by economic blockades.
Right. So when we're talking about business, which is a good area to talk about because it will affect everybody. It will affect people with their jobs, with what they can and can't do, their housing, everything. So how do you anticipate the future will look like if we're outside of Europe?
Well, in terms of the variables, personally, I struggle to accept that a capitalist system will maximise its utility, will maximise its sales potential as soon as possible. The problem may come in that we may be seen as being weak now because we are only one country rather than 28. This is, I think, the core argument, that if we trade as 300 million people, then we are stronger than trading as 60 million people, and that other businesses might take advantage of us.
Other businesses inside the EU might take advantage of us if we haven't got the right standards in place and we don't meet all their tariffs and set standards of production and things like that, which we already do. But
yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point, because generally speaking, we have asked in the past Europe to rise up to our standards in agriculture, pollution, emissions, but we have not been the one that has been forced to spend more, but actually we've said it's kind of unfair because we have better standards than most of the countries in Europe.
I would think it would be interesting to see how the other countries reacted to us leaving, in terms of if you wanted to export shoes to Spain. I understand that if we weren't in, you'd have to pay tax to import and then tax to re-export back into Europe to other countries if you were making products which used things from different parts of the EU.
So you're manufacturing.
If you're, I think manufacturing
spread
may be
out.
more affected than services, because you can sell around the world online, whatever happens, and we are quite a big service industry country, but manufacturing could be affected.
Well, I think it will. I think it's safe to say that it will be. But we do import and export manufactured goods with China and the US at the moment.
And this region, Sheffield City region in South Yorkshire, has, I think, somewhere in the region of billions of pounds of manufacturing.
Well, manufacturing is kind of important here.
Yeah.
But you could look at the issue that's happened recently in Russia, where they stopped the import of fish products from the UK and Europe. And
Well, they did it from Europe.
That affected the European market in terms of sales, so they've had to look for alternative markets. So the similar scenario might happen for the UK if our market disappeared from anywhere.
But Europe didn't stop that from happening, though, did it?
No.
So that kind of
It's
makes
an external one.
Well, but it made the argument that so much for Europe being stronger, Russia still stepped out, even though we had all of Europe there saying, what are you doing?
Mm.
Russia said, no, we're not going to trade with any country. So maybe if we were on our own, Russia might have been more willing to get into a trade agreement with us as a small country, rather than its annoyance with France, Germany, Italy, Spain. Would it not be easier, your point of Uber, of being a more dynamic situation, would it not be easier to come to an agreement with a foreign country outside of Europe much quicker than if you've got to get 28 or more countries to agree first on how you then deal with a foreign country? I think we've seen that quite eloquently done with China and the steel issue. That by the time we have discussions about what level of extra tax we place on Chinese steel coming into the Europe, our steel industries were pretty much on their knees or sort of posted for sale.
So one of the things to consider is responsiveness in your business.
Well, what wasn't the reason that a lot of one of the Welsh steel industry was closed? Because the Dutch steel industry, the steel factory, was more advanced. And because we're in Europe, it's very, very easy to shut down one factory in Europe and expand another factory in Europe for the very reason we're in Europe.
Right, okay.
Could that not be the situation? Would be harder if we were a separate country. That it would be more expensive and certainly more complicated for Tata to do that.
The question would be, would Tata be here in the first place?
But they are here.
And only because they bought up what was left of British Steel.
True. but
and its successors.
but yes, I was just making the case that in Europe, this global, not global market, but the European market allows elements of the market to be expanded and contracted very, very easily. That's one of its strengths.
And one of its weaknesses.
But if you're the country that is suffering the contraction, and I think Greece has suffered quite seriously, far more than perhaps the UK, as money has poured out of Greece elsewhere in Europe, which has been very easy to do, especially since they all the same currency, they have really felt. So
can I ask you, what has this got to do with futures? How you see it affecting a future scenario?
Well, it's this idea of you need to pick a future scenario. I find it very hard to find anybody willing to say this is the future. We can say this was the past and let us assume that the past will just project forwards.
And do you think that's a wise thing to do?
I think that's a catastrophic idea.
Because
we have seen how much faster politics and Europe has changed, is changing as we move forwards in time since we entered pretty much this decade, I would argue.
Since even the decision to have the referendum has
geared
been
that.
taken, that there has been a speed up in discussions between countries which you might not have had previously. People have pushed things, I suppose, borders, and I know we're not talking about that, but people have taken decisions on borders and relationships and robustness in policy that they might not have pushed previously, but they're sort of pulling themselves up and being more forceful now.
Well,
individually, that seems to be a thing.
Well, economic activity, the growth, there seems to be this. The term economics term is sometimes called fishbone economics. And
could you explain that?
I absolutely will. What it analogizes is the idea of the ribs on a fish.
Right.
Okay, and what you will need to visualize is you assume you're on a certain pathway, and you assume at some point in the future that you're going to improve. So you can imagine a horizontal line which then curves up. Now once you reach the point where you assumed things were going to improve and you had this growth curve projected, when it doesn't happen, the economists then project, oh, it's going to happen, all right, it didn't happen then, it's going to happen in 6 months' time or in 3 months' time. And they do another curve. And then when that doesn't happen again, they do another curve. Until eventually, when you look into the past, you see what looks like the ribs of a fish, and hence the term fishbone economics. So you get this projection. And I fear, well, I personally believe, that this idea of economic growth is very much that. Everyone keeps saying, we're nearly there to start again since the dip in 2000, whatever you want to call it, in 2008, 2009, and everything's going to be fine. Interest rates.
You mean the economic dip?
Yes, and our recovery will continue at a pace, and it was just in the future, and that was one of the arguments that was portrayed, that in 20 or 30 years in the future, we've been told by some publications, by our government, that we're going to be weak, we're going to be poorer, weaker, politically more vulnerable in the future. And that idea of a projection of 20 years into the future, I find uncomfortable that anybody is capable of projecting 20 years into the future for a single country, never mind for an agglomeration of no less than 30 countries by 20 years' time.
However, individual businesses could think about where would they like to be in 5 years'
That's
time.
a great
They
thing.
don't seem to do that enough in terms of the landscape. And there's quite a lot of information in the report which actually does give a context to that. And they could make some more decisions based on that.
I think that's very much the issue here versus the media coverage. Is that the media coverage is driven by what awful things might happen, rather than what you just said about what would you like the situation to be like in the future, and how do we get to that point? And that's true. And if we stay in Europe or leave Europe, a business would still hopefully make that.
So what does a sustainable business look like? How is it going to get its fuel supply? Where is its labour coming from? What will its markets be?
This surely is all encompassed by the EU's role. So we need to have an understanding, before we can even address the issues that you're talking about, Karen, we need to really understand what is the EU's role. What has its role been up until now? What is its role now? And how do we envisage its role in a future scenario?